The morning sun cast long shadows across the Charleston Police Department parking lot as Detective James Morrison pulled up in his well-worn police cruiser. He straightened his badge, a gesture he'd inherited from his father and grandfather, both cops who'd walked these same streets. The brass gleamed in the early light, a symbol of authority he'd worn for 20 years. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the briefing room as Morrison settled into his usual seat, front row, center. Other officers filtered in, exchanging tired nods and mumbled greetings. Morrison sipped his coffee, black and bitter, just like his outlook on what the day would bring. The morning briefing started with the usual updates: petty thefts, domestic disturbances, and then something that made everyone sit up straight. Fourth bank hit in 2 months, Lieutenant Chen announced, pinning photos to the board. Same pattern. Professional. Clean. No witnesses. The room buzzed with tension as security camera stills flashed on the screen. Morrison leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. He'd seen his share of bank jobs, but this was different. These weren't smash-and-grab amateurs. The perpetrators knew bank procedures, security protocols, and exactly when to strike. But Morrison had already made up his mind about who was behind it, his prejudices coloring his judgment before he'd seen a single piece of evidence. Back at his desk, Morrison pulled up files from previous robberies in predominantly black neighborhoods. His computer screen flickered with faces of past arrests, each one a testament to his biased approach to policing. The excessive force complaints filed against him sat in a thick folder, buried deep in his drawer, dismissed by supervisors who shared his worldview. "You should look at the financial district angle," Officer Rodriguez suggested, dropping a file on his desk. "These robbers know too much about banking operations." Morrison brushed off the suggestion with a wave of his hand. "I know exactly what we're dealing with here," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone that made younger officers uncomfortable. Rodriguez shook her head and walked away, leaving Morrison to his narrow view of the world. The day wore on as Morrison drove through his usual patrol route. He passed kids playing basketball, families heading to church, and business owners opening their shops. But through his prejudiced lens, he saw only potential suspects, threats, and problems. He'd inherited more than just a badge from his father. He'd inherited a worldview that divided the city into us and them. At home that evening, Morrison sat in his favorite armchair, surrounded by framed photos of 3 generations of police officers. His father's stern face stared down from the wall, a reminder of the old-school policing he'd been taught to revere. The evening news droned on about the bank robberies, but Morrison barely listened. He was too busy planning tomorrow's surveillance of neighborhoods that had nothing to do with the sophisticated heists. His phone buzzed, a message from headquarters. The FBI was sending an agent to take lead on the case. Morrison's jaw clenched. Federal involvement meant things were bigger than they'd thought, but all he could think about was some outsider coming in to tell them how to do his job. Little did Morrison know, the arriving FBI agent would shake the very foundation of his beliefs and force him to question everything he thought he knew about policing, people, and himself. As he fell asleep that night, the city lights twinkling outside his window, Morrison had no idea that his comfortable world of prejudice and power was about to be turned upside down. Tomorrow would bring more than just another day on the job. It would bring the beginning of a journey that would challenge every assumption, every bias, and every truth he thought he knew. But for now, he slept soundly, unaware that his biggest case would become his biggest lesson, one that would change not just his career, but his entire life. The morning briefing room was more crowded than usual. Officers lined the walls, curiosity bringing in even those who were off duty. Morrison sat in his usual spot, arms crossed, as Lieutenant Chen introduced their new FBI partner. Special Agent Thomas walked in, his dark skin contrasting with his crisp navy suit, and Morrison felt his shoulders tense automatically. "I appreciate the welcome," Agent Thomas said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone lean in slightly. I've reviewed the case files, and I believe we're dealing with something more complex than initially thought. He began laying out photos and documents on the board with a precision that spoke of years of experience. Morrison watched, trying to mask his discomfort as Agent Thomas demonstrated a thorough understanding of not just the robberies, but the city's banking infrastructure. The agent's presentation was flawless, his analysis sharp, yet Morrison found himself looking for flaws, any excuse to dismiss the agent's expertise. "Detective Morrison," Agent Thomas called out, "I understand you've been lead on this case. I'd like to review your findings this afternoon." The room went quiet, all eyes shifting between the two men. Morrison nodded stiffly, knowing he couldn't refuse without making himself look unprofessional. Later, in Morrison's cramped office, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Agent Thomas sat across from him, methodically going through case files. "These surveillance points you've chosen," the agent said, tapping a map. "What made you focus on these particular areas?" Morrison shifted in his chair, his usual confidence wavering under the agent's steady gaze. "Past experience," he answered gruffly, but even to his own ears, the justification sounded hollow. "I see," Agent Thomas replied, pulling out his laptop. "Let me show you something interesting." He brought up security footage from the latest robbery, pointing out details Morrison had overlooked. The robbers' knowledge of camera blind spots, their familiarity with vault procedures, their timing synchronized with electronic security resets. Despite himself, Morrison found his attention caught by the agent's observations. These weren't just lucky breaks. These were inside jobs requiring intimate knowledge of banking systems. His theories about the perpetrators' identities began to feel shakier by the minute. "I'd like us to re-interview the bank employees," Agent Thomas suggested, "particularly those with access to security protocols." His tone was collaborative, not commanding, making it harder for Morrison to maintain his defensive stance. Throughout the afternoon, they visited 3 banks together. Morrison watched as Agent Thomas conducted interviews with a skill that made people open up naturally. He noticed how bank managers who'd been dismissive with him earlier now shared detailed information, impressed by the agent's grasp of financial operations. "You know," Agent Thomas said as they drove between locations, "sometimes the most obvious answer isn't the right one. We have to let the evidence guide us, not our assumptions." The words weren't accusatory, but they hit home. By evening, Morrison sat alone at his desk, staring at the caseboard. Agent Thomas's insights had punched holes in his previous theories, but admitting that meant confronting something deeper, something uncomfortable about himself. The evidence was pointing in a direction he hadn't wanted to see. His phone buzzed, a text from Agent Thomas with additional security footage to review. Morrison found himself studying it carefully, noticing things he'd missed before. The professionalism of the operation, the insider knowledge, the sophisticated timing. It all painted a picture very different from what he'd initially assumed. As he finally headed home that night, Morrison's mind was churning. Tomorrow would bring more work with Agent Thomas, more evidence that might challenge his long-held beliefs. Part of him wanted to resist, to cling to the comfortable certainty of his prejudices. But another part, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about this case, and about himself. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Morrison was nursing his 3rd coffee when Agent Thomas burst into the office, holding a stack of financial records. The excitement in his eyes made Morrison sit up straight, coffee forgotten. "Look at this." Agent Thomas spread the documents across Morrison's desk. Every robbery coincided with specific electronic security updates. Only someone with high-level clearance would know these timeframes. His finger traced patterns through the data, connecting dots that had been invisible before. Morrison leaned forward, squinting at the timestamps. "These security patches," he said slowly, "they're not public information." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These weren't street criminals they were chasing. These were executives in suits and ties. Agent Thomas nodded. I've cross-referenced the access logs. 3 names keep popping up. He pulled out photos of well-dressed men, all white, all wearing expensive suits, all respected members of Charleston's business community. Meet our prime suspects. Morrison's world tilted sideways. These were men he'd nodded to at charity events, men whose donations funded police galas. He pushed back from his desk, his chair scraping against the floor. There has to be another explanation, he muttered, reaching for a familiar file of suspects from his previous investigations. Detective. Agent Thomas's voice was firm but patient. Look at the evidence. The timing, the access patterns, the insider knowledge, it all points to them. He laid out more documents, security footage, screenshots, and banking records. These men used their positions to orchestrate every robbery. But Morrison wasn't ready to let go. He pulled out files on local black business owners, trying to force connections that weren't there. What about these guys? They could be involved. They could be. Stop. Agent Thomas's command was quiet but powerful. He picked up Morrison's files and placed them beside the evidence they'd gathered. Tell me, without using assumptions, without using prejudice, show me one piece of evidence linking these people to our robberies. The silence in the office grew heavy. Morrison stared at the files, his mouth dry. 20 years of police work, 20 years of seeing what he expected to see, and now he couldn't find a single solid connection. I've watched you these past weeks, Agent Thomas continued, his voice level. You're a good detective when you let the evidence speak. But right now, you're letting something else do the talking. The truth of those words hit Morrison hard. Images flashed through his mind, all the times he'd stopped black drivers without cause, all the homes he'd searched based on hunches, all the young men he'd roughed up because they looked suspicious. Outside, the rain drummed against the windows as Morrison stood up and walked to the evidence board. His hands shook slightly as he took down the photos of innocent people he'd been trying to frame. One by one, they fell into the trash, leaving only the real evidence, the damning trail that led straight to the city's white-collar criminals. What do we do now? Morrison's voice was rough with emotion. Now, Agent Thomas gathered the financial records. Now we build our case. The right way. Based on facts, not prejudice. Based on evidence, not assumptions. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. They tracked money trails, interviewed bank employees who'd been afraid to speak up, and pieced together a picture of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Charleston's banking industry. As evening fell, Morrison sat alone in his office, staring at his reflection in his dark computer screen. The face looking back at him was the same one he'd seen every morning for 20 years. But today, for the first time, he saw something different. He saw the truth about himself, and it was harder to face than any criminal he'd ever chased. His phone buzzed. Agent Thomas had sent over the arrest warrants for their suspects. Tomorrow, they would move on the bankers, but tonight, Morrison had to sit with a different kind of justice. The harsh light of truth illuminating decades of prejudice he could no longer deny or defend. The arrest of the bank executives sent shockwaves through Charleston. News vans crowded the police station parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. But Morrison wasn't thinking about the headlines. He sat in the evidence room, surrounded by boxes of his old case files, each one feeling heavier than the last. Agent Thomas found him there, staring at a case from 5 years ago. Sometimes, the agent said, pulling up a chair, the hardest evidence to face is our own past. Morrison held up a file. 2019. Corner store robbery. I was so sure I had the right guy. His voice cracked slightly. Young black store clerk. I was convinced he staged it himself. Ruined his life, his career. He dropped the file on the table. Never even looked at the store owner's gambling debts. Agent Thomas didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, he opened his laptop and pulled up a database. Let me show you something, he said, typing quickly. These are national statistics on arrest rates, conviction rates, and case dismissals, broken down by race and neighborhood. The numbers on the screen told a story Morrison had never wanted to read. Patterns emerged, the same patterns he'd been part of for 20 years. His chest felt tight as he recognized his own prejudices reflected in the data. "Here's the thing about bias," Agent Thomas said quietly. "It doesn't just hurt the people we target. It makes us miss real criminals because we're looking in the wrong direction. Like with our bank robbers." Morrison thought about all the times he pulled over black drivers in expensive cars, assuming the vehicles were stolen. How many actual car thieves had driven past while he was harassing innocent people? How many real crimes had gone unsolved because he was too busy acting on his prejudices? He opened another file, a drug bust from 2017. "I swore I smelled marijuana," he read from his own report. But looking at it now, he couldn't finish the sentence. The evidence had been flimsy at best, non-existent at worst. But he'd pushed for charges anyway, convinced he was right because the suspect fit his preconceived image of a criminal. The afternoon wore on as Morrison dug deeper into his past cases. Agent Thomas stayed, offering insights and asking questions that made Morrison think harder about each situation. They ordered pizza, the boxes stacking up next to case files as hours turned into evening. "You know what gets me?" Morrison said, wiping grease from his fingers. "My dad always said he was just doing his job too. 3 generations of cops in my family, 3 generations of this." He gestured at the files spread around them. Agent Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Morrison picked up a recent case file, one he closed just months ago. "I can start here," he said. "This one never felt right, even then. Guy's probably still in jail, and I never even looked at the security footage from the other street corner." As night fell outside, Morrison started a new pile of cases to review. Each file represented someone's life, someone's future that he might have damaged through his biased police work. The task ahead was overwhelming, but for the first time in his career, he felt something different. Not the satisfaction of making arrests, but the weight of responsibility to make things right. "It's not going to be easy," Agent Thomas said as they finally prepared to leave. "Some of your colleagues won't understand. Some will actively fight against what you're doing." Morrison looked at the stacks of files he'd marked for review. "Maybe not," he said. "But I owe it to every person in these files to try. And to every person I might encounter tomorrow." As they walked out of the evidence room, Morrison flipped off the light, leaving behind the physical files but carrying their weight in his conscience. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more hard truths to face. But for the first time in his career, he was ready to look at evidence with clear eyes, not just in his current cases, but in the trail of injustice he'd left behind. The raid was supposed to be routine. Early morning light was just beginning to touch the city's skyline as the Joint FBI Police Task Force gathered outside the downtown office building. Morrison checked his vest straps one last time, the weight of his recent revelations still heavy on his mind. "Remember," Agent Thomas briefed the team, "these suspects are white-collar criminals. But they're desperate. They know we've frozen their accounts. They might have weapons." His eyes met Morrison's briefly. "Stay alert." The elevator ride to the 14th floor was silent, tense. Morrison found himself standing next to Agent Thomas, their shoulders almost touching. Strange, he thought, how just weeks ago he couldn't stand being in the same room as the man. Now, somehow, his presence was reassuring. The first sign something was wrong was the empty reception desk. "They knew we were coming," Agent Thomas whispered. The team spread out, moving through the maze of cubicles with practiced precision. Morrison heard it first, a slight scraping sound from the executive office. He turned, raising his hand to signal the others, when he caught a flash of movement in his peripheral vision. Time seemed to slow down. "Gun," someone shouted. Morrison felt a powerful shove from his left. He stumbled, falling behind a desk just as a shot rang out. Where he had been standing a split second before, Agent Thomas now crouched, returning fire. The bullet that would have hit Morrison's chest had left a hole in the wall behind him. The next few minutes were chaos. More shots, shouts, the sound of running feet. When it was over, 3 suspects were in custody, and Morrison sat on the floor, his back against a file cabinet, trying to process what had just happened. Agent Thomas approached, holstering his weapon. "You okay?" he asked, extending his hand to help Morrison up. Morrison stared at the offered hand, then at the man who had just saved his life. The same man he disrespected, dismissed, and distrusted because of the color of his skin. Something inside him broke. "I don't." Morrison's voice cracked. "I don't deserve that. Any of it. The backup, the save." He gestured helplessly at the scene around them. 20 years of being exactly what's wrong with this job, and you still. This isn't about deserving. Agent Thomas cut him off. This is about doing what's right. Every time. For everyone. That's the job. He kept his hand extended, waiting. Morrison took it, letting himself be pulled to his feet. But he couldn't let go. The weight of everything. His prejudices, his past actions, the lives he'd impacted, came crashing down. Right there, in the middle of the crime scene, surrounded by fellow officers and FBI agents, Morrison broke down. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "God, I'm so sorry. For everything. For how I treated you, for all the people I've hurt, for—" He couldn't continue. Agent Thomas put a steady hand on his shoulder. "Then do something about it," he said quietly. "That's all any of us can do. Acknowledge our mistakes and do better." As the suspects were led away in handcuffs, Morrison watched the scene through new eyes. He saw Officer Rodriguez coordinating with an FBI agent, their differences forgotten in the pursuit of justice. He saw young officers looking to Agent Thomas with respect and admiration. He saw what police work could be when stripped of prejudice and bias. Later that day, sitting in the debriefing room, Morrison listened as Agent Thomas led the discussion. The same voice he'd once resented now represented everything he wanted to become: professional, fair, focused on evidence and justice rather than assumptions and bias. "Good work today, everyone," Agent Thomas concluded. As the room cleared out, he turned to Morrison. "Ready to start fresh tomorrow?" Morrison nodded, feeling both exhausted and somehow lighter than he had in years. "Yeah," he said. "But not just tomorrow. Every day from now on." Walking to his car that evening, Morrison touched the spot on his vest where the bullet would have hit. One split-second decision by someone he'd wrongly judged had saved his life. Now it was his turn to make decisions that could save others, not from bullets, but from the kind of prejudice that had poisoned his own career for so long. The stack of case files on Morrison's desk seemed to grow taller every day. Each folder represented a life he might have damaged, a future he might have derailed. His coffee grew cold as he reviewed yet another arrest from his past, looking at it with new eyes. "You're making waves," Officer Rodriguez said, leaning against his doorframe. "Not everyone's happy about these reviews." She nodded toward a group of older officers who'd been giving him the cold shoulder all week. Morrison sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "I know. Got another anonymous note in my locker this morning." He didn't need to explain what it said. The message was always the same. Traitor. Soft. Weak. Agent Thomas walked in, carrying fresh coffee for both of them. "How's the Wilson case looking?" he asked, settling into the spare chair. "Bad," Morrison admitted, pushing the file forward. "Really bad. I completely ignored witness statements that didn't fit what I wanted to believe. Kid spent 2 years in jail while the real perpetrator walked free." His voice was heavy with regret. "So what are you going to do about it?" Agent Thomas asked, The same question he always asked when Morrison discovered another mistake from his past. Morrison pulled out a form he'd been working on. Already called the DA's office. They're reviewing the case. And I've got a meeting with Wilson next week. His hands shook slightly as he took a sip of the fresh coffee. Not looking forward to facing him, but I owe him that much. The office grew quiet as other officers headed out for lunch. Morrison stayed at his desk, surrounded by the evidence of his past mistakes. Agent Thomas remained too, helping him sort through the complicated legal process of reopening old cases. "You know what's the hardest part?" Morrison said, breaking the silence. "Realizing that every time I acted on my prejudices, I wasn't just hurting innocent people. I was letting guilty people walk free. Like those bank executives. How many times did I miss the real criminals because I was too busy hassling innocent folks who didn't look like my idea of a respectable citizen?" A knock on the door interrupted them. It was Lieutenant Chen. "The community oversight program you proposed," she said. "The chief wants to hear more about it. Tomorrow morning." Morrison exchanged glances with Agent Thomas. They'd been working on the proposal for weeks, a program to review police practices, train officers to recognize their biases, and build better relationships with the community. "We'll be ready," Morrison said. After Chen left, he pulled out the proposal draft. "Think they'll go for it?" "Some will resist," Agent Thomas replied honestly. "Change isn't easy. But others will surprise you. People can grow when given the chance. You're proof of that." The afternoon brought another challenge. A young black couple came to file a complaint about an aggressive traffic stop. Morrison watched as some of his former friends brushed them off, making excuses about standard procedure. He stood up, walked over, and did something the old Morrison would never have done. He listened. "I'd like to take your statement," he told them, leading them to his office. "And then, if you're willing, I'd like you to share your experience at our next department training session. Officers need to hear this." Later, as the sun set over Charleston, Morrison stood in the parking lot with Agent Thomas, reviewing their presentation for tomorrow. "You know this won't be easy," Agent Thomas warned. "Some officers will fight back hard. They'll say you're betraying the Brotherhood." Morrison watched a family walking past the station. Parents and two young kids, their skin darker than his. Once, he might have viewed them with suspicion. Now he saw what they really were, just people, living their lives, deserving of the same respect and protection he always given to those who looked like him. "The real betrayal," he said quietly, "was everything I did before. This," he held up the oversight program proposal. "This is finally doing the job right." As they headed back inside to finalize their presentation, Morrison noticed his reflection in the station window. The face looking back at him wasn't the same one he'd seen in his mirror all those years. This face carried the weight of understanding, the determination to make amends, and something else. Hope for a better way forward. 6 months after the bank robbery case, the Charleston courthouse buzzed with activity. Morrison straightened his tie as he watched the last of the bank executives receive his sentence. 20 years, the same amount of time Morrison had spent on the force, letting his prejudices guide his badge. Quite a different scene from what you originally imagined, isn't it? Agent Thomas stood beside him, both of them watching as the convicted banker was led away in handcuffs. Morrison nodded, remembering how differently he'd pictured this case ending when it first began. "You know, I've been thinking about retirement," he said. "But not anymore. There's too much work left to do." Outside the courthouse, they walked past a group of young police academy recruits. Morrison recognized them from the new training program he and Agent Thomas had developed. These fresh faces would learn something he'd taken far too long to understand: that real police work meant serving and protecting everyone equally. Officer Chen called from Seattle this morning, Agent Thomas mentioned as they grabbed coffee from their usual spot. "Their department wants to implement our training program. That makes 5 cities now." Morrison smiled, remembering the nervous presentation they'd given to the police chief 6 months ago. Now, their community oversight program and bias recognition training were spreading across departments nationwide. It wasn't just about changing individual officers anymore, it was about changing the entire system. Back at the station, Morrison's office looked different these days. Where his father's old police photo once hung, there was now a wall of letters. Thank you notes from people whose cases he'd helped overturn, families he'd apologized to, young officers he mentored in the new way of thinking. Got another review request, Officer Rodriguez said, dropping a file on his desk. Young officer from Atlanta. Says your story inspired him to look at his own biases. She smiled. You're becoming famous, you know. Morrison shook his head. Not famous. Just trying to fix what I can. He opened his laptop, where a draft of his new training manual waited. Agent Thomas, can you look at this section of traffic stops? I want to make sure we're addressing all the subtle ways bias can creep in. They worked late into the evening, fine-tuning the manual that would soon be used to train officers across the country. Morrison's phone buzzed with a text from Lieutenant Chen. Another department interested in their program, this time from Chicago. Remember when you couldn't stand being in the same room as me? Agent Thomas asked, looking up from the manual draft. Morrison felt the familiar mix of shame and gratitude that always came with these memories. Yeah. Now I can't imagine doing any of this without you. He gestured at the wall of letters, the training materials, the case files they were still reviewing. You didn't just save my life that day in the office. You helped me save my soul. A young black officer knocked on the door, one of their new recruits. Sir, we've got a situation downtown. Business owner reporting suspicious activity, but something about the call feels off. Morrison stood up, grabbing his jacket. What's your gut telling you? Well, the recruit said thoughtfully, the caller's description seems based more on prejudice than actual suspicious behavior. I thought maybe we could approach this differently. Morrison smiled at Agent Thomas. This was what change looked like. New officers questioning old assumptions, looking past bias to see the truth. Lead the way, Morrison told the recruit. Show me how you'd handle this the right way. As they walked out of the station, Morrison caught his reflection in the window. Gray had crept into his hair, lines had deepened around his eyes, but there was something else too. A clarity that hadn't been there before. 20 years of wearing a badge had taught him how to be a cop, but it had taken one remarkable FBI agent and a hard look in the mirror to teach him how to be a true guardian of justice. You know what? He said to Agent Thomas as they headed to their cars. Maybe we should add a chapter to the manual about partnership. About how sometimes the person you need to learn from the most is the one you were taught to trust the least. The city lights winked on as dusk settled over Charleston. Somewhere out there, new challenges waited, more minds to change, more wrongs to right. But for the first time in his career, Morrison was ready to face them all with clear eyes, an open mind, and a determination to make sure the next generation of officers would do better than he had done.